Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Gary Schwartz. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, and raised there. In university, I majored in the history of art. When I got a grant to work on Dutch art in the Netherlands, I stayed there and became specialized in Dutch art of the 17th century. I married a Dutch woman. We have 2 children. Next year, I will have been living in the Netherlands for 60 years. Books and articles I have written on Dutch art, especially Rembrandt, have been translated into more than 10 languages, though not yet in Chinese. Now let me tell you why I was so kindly invited by the National Museum of Taiwan History to speak to you. In November 2021, I visited the PAN Fine Arts Fair in Amsterdam, as I do every year. This time, a big shock awaited me. At the stand of the art dealer Zebrechts and Ruel, I came across a painting of which I took some quick photos like these. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. An extraordinary painting of a Dutch divine minister, painted twice, in the middle of a mass congregation of men and women. The inscription identifies the minister as Robertus Junius, tells us that it shows him in the village of Sulang, and that the congregation was painted in Taiwan by a Chinese artist. The portraits of Junius himself, as we shall see, were made by a Dutch artist. Everyone in the fair should have been surprised, but I was more surprised than most. That had a special reason. In 2009 and 2010, I had participated in an intensive research project at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in a group of 10 dedicated colleagues. Our aim was to tell all the important things there were to know about artistic contact between the Netherlands and the countries of Asia in the 17th and 18th century. Had we known about the painting at the PAN, it would have had a chapter of its own. We had not come across any work of art on which a Dutch and an Oriental artist had worked like that painting. The image on the cover comes from my chapter on Dutch artists in Persia. It is a drawing by one Persian artist, Muin Musavi, showing another Persian artist, the great Riza-i Abbasi, making a drawing of a European. It's an image of the yearning of one culture for understanding another. The same can be said of the painting I saw at the PAN, which I now show you in all its glory. Display of the clothing, figures, and assembly of the new Christians in Formosa, in the village of Sulang, in the manner that the word of God was preached in their language by minister Robertus Junius, in the year 1643, painted there by a Chinese artist. Without this informative, proud inscription in the middle of the painting, our understanding of this unique representation would have been limited. What could we have known? Importantly, we would have been able to identify the man depicted twice in the middle as the Dutch Reformed minister Robertus Junius. The name is a Latin form of his Dutch name, Robert de Jonge. It was customary for ministers in the Dutch Reformed Church to use Latinized forms that way. We would have been able to identify him because we see his image in a portrait print with a caption telling who he was. The caption says that the print was copied from a painted portrait of Junius by an artist named Adrian Sauter. If I reverse the image in the print and show it in the direction in which it was drawn on the plate, you can see how exact the resemblance is. The portrait in the upper register was also made after the same model, but only for the head. Later on, I will tell you how I think the big painting was made. Knowing who the sitter was would have told us that the actions in which he is engaged took place on the island of Formosa, where Junius served from 1629 to 1643 in two capacities for the Dutch East India Company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie in Dutch, abbreviated VOC. He was a minister to the Reformed Christians stationed there, and a missionary charged with converting the indigenous people of the island to the Dutch Reformed brand of Protestantism. In the lecture, I will call the island Formosa, as the Portuguese had named it. The place named Taiwan was then applied only to a small stretch of the coast. Here is a Dutch map of the time, with north to the left. The inscription tells us important things that we cannot be deduced from the imagery alone. We are told that Minister Junius is addressing a congregation in the village of Sulong in 1643. From the rich documentation that has survived on the Dutch presence in Formosa, we know one thing and another about Sulong. The villages there had a certain reputation to the Dutch. In an authoritative 17th century volume on the Dutch in Asia, we read of the Formosans. They are friendly, loyal, and kind-hearted people, not inclined to stealing or theft, except for those in the village of Sulong. We even have relevant information about relations between Robertus Junius and the villagers of Sulong, which were not always as mutually respectful as we see in the painting. Allow me to shock you at the start by quoting a single line from a missive written by Robertus Junius to the Amsterdam Chamber of the Dutch East India Company in 1636, 7 years before the date of the painting. On January 10th, all the fighters were again assembled in Singkan, where, in front of our church, 7 prisoners of Sulong were decapitated. In front of our church. This stunning event, which was well known to all the adults in the composition, cannot be unrelated to the painting. In other words, the inscription alerts us to life and death tensions built into the seemingly pacific scene. I will now sketch those tensions and advance an interpretation of the painting that takes account of them. The stories and issues involved can be reconstructed thanks to publications of the time and the preservation of the vast archives of the Dutch East India Company. The foremost specialist in this material is Professor Leonard Blusset of Leiden University, who lectured on Robertus Junius at the time of the opening of the exhibition and who generously helped me with my own lecture. Think of it. At the beginning of the 17th century, in 1602, there was a bunch of Dutch businessmen living in coastal towns no further than a good day's sail from each other, from A to Z, Amsterdam to Zeeland. They had gotten rich by shipping grain from the Baltic and fishing herring out of the North Sea and selling them to their countrymen and the rest of Europe, profiting in particular in years of sparse harvests. Now they took it upon themselves to do the same with spices from the East, silk and porcelain from China, and silver from Japan. Never mind that they now had to sail around Africa to the biggest continents and vastest oceans of the world on the other side of the globe, and to dislodge the Portuguese who already had a hold on this trade. They knew there would be problems, which led them to finance their enterprise mainly with other people's money. But what they saw above all was the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, the threefold return on investment that the adventurer Dirk Gerritzoon Pomp claimed to have made by sailing with the Portuguese. The board of the newly founded Dutch East India Company, called the Gentlemen 17, could not possibly have known what they were getting themselves into, and events of the first decades showed it. The arrival of the VOC in Formosa, with which we are dealing, and their precipitate expulsion from there less than 40 years later, was a tragicomedy of errors. It started 20 years into the existence of the VOC. Initially, the Dutch had set up a post in Bantam on the north coast of Java. There they entered a market that must have looked like the bar scene in Star Wars, with Middle Eastern, Indian, Malaysian, Indonesian, Chinese, Japanese, and Portuguese traders dealing in hundreds of products and a bewildering mixture of currencies. In 1619, wishing to operate more aggressively from quarters under its exclusive control, the company built a compound of its own about 200 kilometers to the east. It gave it the name Batavia, after a tribe that the Romans encountered in ancient Holland. This period map has east to the left. There, the VOC felt free to violate the existing mix of regulations, negotiations, and stratagems by which other parties did business. Here is an idyllic image of a market outside the castle, 40 years on, painted around 1662, after drawings from the mid-1650s, with a peaceful mix of Indonesian, African, Chinese, Dutch, and people with other backgrounds. Not everyone came there of their own free will. In fact, at the time the painting was made, half the population of Batavia were slaves. Some were made captive in a particularly tragic way. In 1621, even before the founding of Batavia, the Dutch had carried out a genocidal raid on the island of Banda, 2,500 kilometers away. The aim was to secure a monopoly on nutmeg and mace, valuable spices for which Banda was the only source on earth. The islanders wished to continue trading with different buyers, as they had always done, but that was not good enough for the Dutch. The Gentlemen 17 ordered Governor-General Jan Pieterszoon Koen to try to gain exclusive buying rights. He sailed off there, but then something went badly wrong. The negotiating party he put ashore was seen by the natives as an enemy incursion, and they were murdered. This demanded retaliation, which Koen carried out by slaughtering or enslaving most of the population of the guilty island. Descendants of theirs were among the population of Batavia in the painting of the market. Koen's genocidal excess caused a bitter shock at the time and continues to bother the conscience of at least some Dutch people. The issue is acute once more today, as activists are trying to have the statue of Jan Pieterszoon Koen in his hometown of Hoorn removed from its pedestal outside the town museum. However, he was not punished or even reprimanded for this action. This provided cover for keeping the possibility of murderous intervention on the books for the East India Company. It also sent a message to the rest of Asia and Africa. The message was built into a famous saying of Koen's, "Despair not, spare your enemies not, for God is with us." As we shall see, this attitude plays a role of importance in the story of Robertus Junius in your country. With a success in Banda under his belt, Koen wrote to his superiors in the home country with amazing arrogance that the next target was China. The only language the Chinese understood, he said, was force, and he was going to exercise it to gain the concessions he sought. But he didn't know exactly who to fight. With his small corps, it did not seem like a good idea to attack mainland China, so Kuhn decided to move against the Portuguese, who had permission from the Imperial Ming government to engage in the trade with Japan that the East India Company was after. The Portuguese operated from a post on the island of Macau. The Dutch were, however, no match for the well-defended Portuguese bastion, and in a 3-day battle in June 1622, they were driven off with heavy losses. The commander of the flotilla was wounded and made his escape to the small Pescadores Islands, the Pengus, 150 kilometers offshore. The Dutch constructed a fort there, kidnapping and exploiting Chinese laborers so ruthlessly that most died on the job. From the Pescadores, the company hoped to hamper traffic to the Chinese ports opposite sufficiently to attract concessions in exchange for, quote, protection. This notion, too, testified to the overconfidence, indeed self-deception, of the Dutch. In response to the Dutch threat, the mandarins of the coastal province of Fujian fortified their fleet and sailed on the Pescadores with a force estimated at between 5,000 and 10,000 troops against the Dutch detachment of 850. The ascendancy was a mercy for the Dutch, who could surrender without any further losses. The Fujianese drove them out of their fort into the arms of a consortium of Han-Chinese merchants who, from a base in Formosa, carried out unlicensed traffic with Japan. In August 1624, then, the Dutch retreated from the Pescadores and let the Fujianese merchants take them to the nearby, much larger island that in the previous century the Portuguese had dubbed Ilha Formosa, the lovely island. And so begins the story of the exhibition. The Dutch established their headquarters in an armed compound they named Fort Zeelandia, after the Dutch province Zeeland, meaning land on the sea. There they were to stay for 38 years. Throughout this time, they had to deal with a constantly shifting constellation of contenders: the Imperial Chinese, in the unsettled period of transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty, Fujian province forces, which were distinct from the imperial army and fleet, Fujianese pirates and smugglers, Japanese samurai merchants, Spanish troops on the north of the island, there to protect the Spanish hold on the Philippines, stray Philippines, freelance condottieri with their own armed forces, pirates and privateers flying different flags, and, most importantly, indigenous inhabitants of the headhunting persuasion, in villages engaged in seemingly incessant, vicious combat with each other. In the exhibition is this remarkable 18th century map of Taiwan showing the borders between village and village, ethnic group and ethnic group. This populace had been living on the island for some 15,000 years and had fostered emigrant cultures over a third of the equatorial globe, from Oceania to Madagascar. Enough is said about the diversity of these aboriginals if we report that in a territory the small size of the Netherlands, they have been found to speak 26 languages. The party most nearly in control of events was a Han pirate named Zheng Zhilong. In this scheme of things, the Dutch settlement would have been seen by the Aboriginals as another village, a piece of land peopled by red-haired barbarians, as they called them. In order to establish itself on the island, it had to behave like one, entering into the inter-village politics. It needed all the goodwill it could get, which in the first place came from the closest village to Fort Zeelandia, Sinkan, which allied itself to the company. This was a pitiful toehold for an enterprise that aimed to control the entire island of Formosa, its resources and its commerce, and to use it as a base for commanding Taiwan Strait and the East Chinese Sea. Realizing that it lacked the military means to accomplish these ambitious aims, the VOC took the step that leads into the story of our painting by implementing missionary activity to get a foot in the Taiwanese door. Natives who could be converted to Christianity, the reasoning went, became dependent in some measure on the Dutch and could be brought into a military alliance. This brand of soft power was in its way more demanding than warfare. It required concerted, unrelenting effort, not only to foster and maintain belief in the divinity of Jesus Christ, but also to win the hearts and minds of large groups of the populace. The ordained ministers were aided in this effort by a staff of school teachers and what were called ziekentroosters, comforters of the sick. The comfort they offered came in the form not of nursing care, but readings from the Gospels and the teaching of prayers and catechism. These men were urged to learn a local language and to ingratiate themselves with the villagers by educating their children. Some of these children were their own, born of intercourse with local women that the company urged them to wed, as a legal way of channeling needs that would otherwise lead to licentiousness and its attendant complications. This was a valuable initiative, but much depended on the dedication and capacities of the men sent out by the VOC for the job, who were not always as good as they could have been. The first minister on the island was the perspicacious Dutch-German Reverend Georgius Candidius. Shortly after his arrival in 1627, he moved from Fort Zeelandia to Sinkan in order to learn a local language and familiarize himself with Formosan mores. In his years on the island, Candidius made impressive progress in acquainting a number of locals with the principles of Christianity. Their own belief was based on trust in female priestesses, inibs, who to the Dutch looked like witches. The VOC thought it could make use of the frankly instrumental nature of native belief. The inibs thanked their sway over the people to their ability to produce the goods, cure the sick, bring on the rains, and send troops into battle on auspicious days. If the VOC could beat them at their own game, especially by demonstrating superior might in the field, it would follow that its God was the best. Candidius conducted Christian training sessions, but insightfully refrained from performing baptisms until he had evidence of a genuine wish to convert. Candidius's boss, Governor Peter Naerts, was a manipulative operator with no feeling for the delicacy of Candidius's approach. He constantly offended the Sinkandians, putting the missionary back to square one, time after time. Then Naerts shot himself in the foot. In July 1629, he led a detachment of 60 musketeers to attack the village of Matau, which had given haven to Chinese pirates. The warriors of Matau withdrew and let their women and children wine and dine the soldiers. When they left to return to base, drunk and sated, the Dutch soldiers walked into a fatal trap. Coming to a narrow bridge across a river, the Matau hosts accompanying them kindly offered to hold on to their guns and swords so they could cross safely and keep their weapons dry. In what must be one of the stupidest moves in the annals of warfare, the Dutch thankfully went along with this proposal, whereupon the warriors came out of the woods and slaughtered them to a man. Nouts had left early. The Mathauers then proceeded to ransack the Dutch buildings in Sinkan, including the church, and burn them to the ground. In this rampage, they were joined by forces from other villages, Sulang among them. Jesus was no longer the best God. This is the very juncture at which Robertus Junius set foot on Formosa. He came in the summer of 1629 in the company of a new governor Hans Putmans, who was appointed to replace Nouts, who was discredited even before the debacle of Matau. The 23-year-old native of Rotterdam, with a Dutch father and Scottish mother, Junius was one of the first graduates of the short-lived Seminary of the Indies in Leiden, set up to train missionaries in the East. It was grandly housed in the mansion still standing, belonging to the dean of the seminary, Minister Antonius Valleus. It lies on the most prestigious canal in the city, the Roppenburg. In addition to theology, Christian apologetics, and personal piety, the seminary offered basic instruction in agriculture, technology, and pedagogy to prepare graduates for improving the lives of the people they set out to convert. The seminary was financed by the Dutch East India Company, and its graduates, while they were nominated by Dutch church councils, were in the employ of the VOC, subservient to its aims and principles. That is not to say that commercial interests always prevailed. The company was well aware that clergymen were better informed about the local population than were the merchants and soldiers who carried out the main VOC business. That was the case in Formosa as well. Putmans came with instructions from Kuhn to comply with whatever advice Candidius had to offer. That advice was not exactly what you might expect from a man of God. He advised Putmans to bring ruin on the conspirators from Matau, Sulang, and other villages that had joined in the looting of Sinkan. The ringleaders, he said, must be executed, their possessions burned. Only then could he regain the credibility he needed to resume his civilizing mission. This was the intent that Junius took on from Candidius. Both ministers worked on the governors to send more troops in order to re-establish the prestige of the Christian God and his nation. While awaiting their arrival, which took several years, Junius led the Sinkandians in limited aggressive forays to exact revenge for the humiliating destruction of their village. Bringing back even one head, which is in fact all they achieved the first times out, nonetheless helped to assuage sore feelings. In preparation for the coming retribution, Junius conducted espionage to identify the anti-Dutch conspirators in Matau, Sulang, and their allies, intending to spare innocent villagers when the time came. That time came in the winter of 1635, with the arrival in the summer of 300 musketeers from Batavia. Junius became a field officer in command of a 1,000-man strong battalion of Formosa auxiliaries from Sinkan, who did the main fighting. On horseback he went into the fray as the personal representative of the vengeful Jehovah. As he had written in a letter of the 8th of November 1633 to Putmans, he was, quote, petitioning the Lord of War, who must teach our hands to fight so that Israel, God's own brethren, may emerge, while Amalek goes under. This was language like Jan Pieterszoon Koens. It went even further. The command to Israel made by the Lord of War was to kill every last Amalekite, man, woman, and children. The first order of business to be attended to was settling scores with Matau. The motive was mixed. For the Sincandians, it was a matter of getting even for the sacking of their village in 1629. For the Dutch, it was revenge for the killing of 60 soldiers at the river crossing, but also safeguarding missionary interests, and in extension, laying the groundwork for establishing sovereignty over Formosa. It was November 23rd, 1635. We had not proceeded far in our march when the Sincandians joined us, armed in the usual manner, thus proving their allegiance. We received tidings that the Sincan men had already cut off a head, which they came to show while the blood was still flowing from it. The houses of Matau villagers who had provided intelligence to VOC spies were spared, affording Junius another appropriation of Israelite identity for his behavior. He compared himself to Joshua, who ordered all of Jericho to be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the harlot and all who are with her in her house will live, because she hid the messengers that we sent. Less than 10 years after 1628, when at the age of 22 Robertus Junius completed his theological studies in an exclusive Leiden seminary for Dutch Reformed missionaries, he had become the zealous commander of a headhunting force of native Formosans with the Christian God on his side. Hear how the man of God spent Christmas Day in 1635. On December 25th, we were quite close to the village of Takareang, which had taken part in the sacking of Sincan, and our enemies made their appearance after we had crossed the river. At first there was a skirmish between our Sincandians and the foe, in which native spears only were used, till our van came up and fired their muskets into their midst. The enemy took flight, so that the road to their village lay open before us. On entering, not a single soul was to be seen. Deciding to set fire to it, we secured a suitable place outside the village where the fire could not reach us. The image above of hostilities on Ambon in 1618 gives an idea of how things went in Formosa as well, with spears, bows, and arrows, and beheading knives against muskets. Animal warfare was another significant factor. On the day after Christmas, December 26, 1635, wrote Junius, we were surprised that the enemy, known to be such great warriors, should have left us perfectly unmolested during the whole night. Later, we were told that they were exceedingly afraid of the horses and dogs we had with us, nor did they like our drum. Next in line, after Takareang, was Sulang. On January 7, 1636, Junius's forces captured a chieftain who, quote, had participated in the murder of our countrymen and had never ceased to show the wickedness of his heart against us whenever an opportunity arose. The Dutch took some other captives as well back to the allied village of Sincan. There, on January 10th, we quote Junius as above, quote, in front of our church, 7 prisoners of Sulang were decapitated. The governor's motive for thus acting was to bind the Sincanese ever closer to us and to turn them from the people of Sulang. Let those words sink in. 7 years before the painting of native churchgoers in Sulang was made, the Dutch were playing inter-village politics to humiliate and punish Sulang to the point of executing inhabitants who made things difficult for them. Whatever our own judgment of events, Ministers Candidius and Junius were right that their show of force would bring the populace around. After the destruction of Takareang and the humbling of Sulong, treaties were signed with village after village, stating in Article 1 that they were to surrender their country and their possessions to the States of Holland, in token whereof they were to bring some small pinang and coconut trees planted in the soil of that place to the castle. On February 24th and 25th, Sulong was brought into the fold on a visit at which the Dutch were fed copious banquets. There, Junius reports, one of their newly appointed commanders addressed his fellow villagers in eloquent language, echoing my own words and saying, "You evildoers, cease your wickedness, for if not, we shall have to seize you, bind you, and deliver you over to the Dutch." Junius presented the glad tidings to the company and report to the Amsterdam chamber. "Be assured that the Lord has given Taiwan and the dominion over these lands into our hands, not only for the purpose of trade and to haul away tons of gold, but also so that we bring to the inhabitants and import the unutterable riches of Christ, goods that abide unto all eternity." The church authorities were mightily impressed by what Junius was accomplishing. In 1643, the consistory of Formosa wrote the Classis of Amsterdam, saying, "Our brother, the Reverend Robert Junius, has baptized in 6 villages upwards of 5,400 persons, of whom all who are living, with the exception of young children, repeat fluently the law of God, the articles of belief, the Lord's Prayer, the prayers before and after meals, and the questions concerning the Christian religion, which is a catechism Mr. Junius will show to you. More than 1,000 couples have also been united in marriage by him, and so far as we know, they all live in conformity with their marriage vows." This quotation is from an English translation, 1650, of a Latin encomium of 1646 on Junius and his work by Caspar Sibelius, a German-Dutch preacher in Deventer. The Latin title, Antidotum Ambitionis a Jesu Christo Salvatore Nostro, credits Junius with an abundance of Christian humility, a quality that did not prevent him from ordering one portrait of himself after another. The English translation was considered of such great value that it was reprinted in 1889 in 2 volumes in connection with the resumption of Protestant missionary efforts in Formosa. Between the letter of 1643 and the book of 1646, 500 souls were added to the number of Formosans saved by Junius, from 5,400 to 5,900. Where Georgius Candidius had been circumspect in administering baptism to potential converts, Junius drained one baptismal font after another. Looking back from the late 19th century, it was clear that Robertus Junius's combined campaign of conquest and conversion in Formosa was the most successful Protestant missionary project ever to have taken place in Asia. These are the historical circumstances prevailing when our painting was made. Without knowing them, we would be at a loss to place it. The date 1643 provides a vital clue to the impetus leading to its creation. That was the year when Reverend Junius left Formosa for good. Before departure, he took a farewell trip to 5 of the 6 villages where he had made his conversions. The largest were Matau, with 2,600 inhabitants, and Sulong, with 2,000. This was more than a courtesy visit. As he went, fellow ministers conducted tests to assay the knowledge of Junius's new Christians. The next visit was to Sulong. October 2nd, the exams in Matau and Sulang. The pupils, as well as the elders and married people, were in agreement with the other inhabitants concerning the queries and responses of the Christian religion. 14 teachers in Sulang and several in Matau have acquitted themselves conscientiously in learning and rehearsing the 360 questions and answers in matters of belief instituted by Reverend Junius. In addition, 2 scribes were tested to see if they could write and spell correctly the words dictated to them, which indeed they could, as can be seen in the examples kept by Reverend Junius. End quote. Sulang had been so thoroughly brought around that Junius's successor, Johannes Babius, moved there, making it the new headquarters for the Reformed Dutch mission on Formosa. The materials with which our painting was made, oil paint on canvas, were not regularly used by Chinese artists, who worked mainly in ink on paper, but it was not at all unknown in Asia. Around 1590, in Kumamoto, Japan, Italian Jesuits had actually founded a Seminario dei Pittori, a painting school, to teach not only Japanese but also Europeans and Chinese a variety of techniques ranging from oil to watercolors. In Dutch East India Company stations as well, there is evidence for the shipping of painting supplies to the East. So, no special explanation is required for the manufacture of the work. Who gave the commission is unknown, but a look at the interests involved can let us make an informed guess. We know that Robertus Junius liked to have portraits made of himself. When he returned to the Netherlands, he sat for paintings and a drawing, which were copied in engravings with adulatory inscriptions. One was even copied on a faience tile. Oh, it's behind my head in the slide. We may assume that it was he who commissioned the portraits of himself in the middle of our painting, most likely painted by Adrian Sauter, copying his own more standard-sized portrait from life of Junius. So I think that Sauter made first a regular easel portrait in normal size and then used it to make the copies in the big painting. This makes Junius the most likely candidate to have asked the Chinese artist to paint his congregants. It would have made sense, however, for the Dutch East India Company to chip in for the costs. The painting was going to be seen in the Netherlands by the persons in the company and the church who were supporting the Formosa mission, and the sight it shows could only have strengthened their resolve to carry on. Let us hypothesize, then, that the idea of having such a painting made came from Robertus Junius, and that it was funded, at least in part, by the VOC. Composition, I think I have made an interesting discovery. Looking at the representation without the space in the middle reserved for Minister Junius, we see a symmetrical disposition of a crowd of men and women in roughly equal numbers. This is so unusual that, to my knowledge, there's only one kind of painting that comes close to it. And this kind of painting was practiced mainly in Fujian province, across the Taiwan Strait from Sulang, the part of China where the Dutch in Formosa recruited most of their labor and craftsmen. These were paintings of ancestors, copied from individual portraits into groups like these. The example illustrated looks like it dates from the 19th century. However, I assume that the structure, alternating rows of men and women, grouped symmetrically around a central axis, is a venerable formula that existed in the late Ming period when the Sulang group portrait was painted. And I further assume that the Chinese artist who painted the latter was familiar with, perhaps trained in this tradition, and used a variant of it for his commission. If so, they fit the description of the Chinese craftsmen and laborers the Dutch were bringing to Formosa for services of all kinds. What must be said emphatically in making this comparison is that while it may be indebted to Chinese ancestor portraits for its format, the Sulang group portrait in no way approaches them in terms of quality. What can be said about the painter is that he, I'm afraid there is no chance the artist was a she, did not strain his talent, so that the painting has the charm of simplicity rather than the irritation of pretentiousness. Turning to the most interesting part of the painting, the congregants, we see that they are divided by gender. On the upper register are two groups of men and boys, 121 in all. On the lower one, 110 women, children and infants. The exclusively male audience for the sermon reflects missionary practice, in which Christian instruction was offered mainly to native men. The lower register is devoted to a rite in which women played the major role, the baptism of newborn infants. One of the big questions concerning the painting is whether the heads are real portraits or not. We can start answering that question with a look at the heads that are painted only in part. No one would take the upper rows of men's or women's heads for true-to-life portraits. These details reveal something disconcerting about the picture. Everyone has the same black hair, and the men even have the same coiffure, anticipating the Beatles' haircut by 320 years. The women have a bit more variety in their hairstyle, but not much. Moreover, everyone has pretty much the same small mouth with red lips. Pictures and descriptions of what the indigenous Sarayan people look like have little to do with what we see in the painting. One point that is made by different observers is that the men wore such large, heavy earrings that their ears became elongated. No one in the painting shows that. The tattoos the men were said to have, or the dark yellow skin coloring, none of that is to be seen. This is how an Aboriginal hunter looked to the German VOC soldier Caspar Schmalkalden in 1650. The costume of the figures is mostly of a type we could call generic Asian. The most frequent upper garment, worn by men and women alike, is a half kimono-like smock folded in a V-neck, with a collar formed by a turned-up edge and a long baggy sleeve. The folds, in all cases but one, fall from the left shoulder across the chest. The lower garments seen on the few figures painted in full are always in a different color than the upper one. They seem to be tied around the waist, like Indonesian sarongs. The styles are pretty timeless, it must be admitted. In contrast to those modes of dress, though, sarongs as well as kimonos, the fabrics from which the clothing of the Formosan men and women is formed is devoid of any and all pattern. One type of dress that stands out belongs to the 12 men and one little boy who wear red jackets over shirts with a flat white collar. Leonard Lucet identifies these men as the Sarayan teachers who were trained by the Dutch ministers, and I think he's right. As we heard, there were 14 of them in Sulang, about the number we see in the painting. Disappointingly, none of the men wears the hat and red cape or carry the baton with a silver grip that Junius gave to men he appointed as village chiefs. Notice that when we see more of the men's dress than their jackets, the artist always gives their breeches and leggings different colors. He was in search of elegant variation. The treatment of the women, with their head coverings and jewelry, is richer in this respect than that of the men. Aside from the kimonos and sarongs they share, the women are dossed out with the following head coverings, with coral beads and without. The identical white-red coloring of all these forms of headwear, worn by 66 of the women in the congregation, convinces me, with my long-time experience with the way women dress when they go out, that it is inconceivable that 66 women of Sulong would all put on such similar things on their heads. This is more like a male artist dressing women than women dressing themselves. Feeling called upon to investigate this phenomenon in the search of possible codes, I went on to the necklaces. They show stereotypes on the same order, composed of different constellations of 3 kinds of hangings: loosely strung, irregularly shaped red elements of various sizes, which I call wisps, coral necklaces with the same tint of red, and pearl necklaces. The only other accoutrement are the earrings worn by only 22 women, never, despite the eyewitness testimonials of Dutch writers, by men. The evidence against real portraiture is accumulating, yet I wouldn't like to give up the idea that at least some of the faces were painted from life. Aren't these people you would recognize in the street? I even have a favorite among the women, a modest young person, unadorned, looking down rather than gazing at Junius, as if sadly pondering what faith is all about. Having said this, I must admit that any identifications we think we can make are bound to be projections. I'm afraid we have to face the likelihood that the painter made his big canvas on a table, on the floor, or against the wall in a room in Fort Zeelandia, with no models to portray, only figures from his imagination. I wish I could stop here, with before our eyes the image of trust between the preacher and his flock that the painting emanates. But there is reason to doubt that this was so. Only a year before the painting was made, on October 5th, 1642, the Dutch executed 3, quote, persons in Sulong by strangling them to death and leaving their bodies at a crossroads to serve as an example to the others. These persons had committed infanticide. I have the suspicion that they may have been Inibs, who, to the scandal of the Dutch, imposed a form of birth control on the Formosans by aborting the embryos of all women who became pregnant unto the age of 30. Perhaps the killing of the infants was seen by the natives as a form of abortion and no crime at all. In any case, they were so frightened by the executions that some people fled the village, saying that the Dutch were going to kill or enslave them all. There was some justification for this in the past behavior of the Dutch, not only on the Banda Islands, but also on the island of Lamay in Formosa, where a massacre was still in progress. The fugitives from Sulong were retrieved by Minister Junius. When the authorities in Formosa reported on this to headquarters in Batavia, they added, "To our mind, dear sirs, this matter is still beclouded in mist, and these people are still rather weak people. requiring quite some polishing." End quote. To help with the polishing of Sulang, Junius' successor Johannes Balvius moved there. What we are seeing, therefore, is less a visual record of actual relations between the new Christians of Sulang and their Dutch minister than a projection of how the Dutch hoped they would look after Balvius had polished them in the spirit of Junius. Let us then look at this affecting image of Dutch and Formosan believers coming together under inspiring ordained authority to assure themselves of everlasting salvation through professing belief in God's Word and saving their newborns by having them baptized in this church as an ideal of intercultural communion in transcendent shared values, an ideal we wish were just a little more real. Thank you.